I haven't talked to this man in a long time, and I have felt the need to because he's one of my favorite that covers wrestling all the way across the pond, as they say, in the United Kingdom. Joining me on the Vaqueros Cafe and Cantina hotline, he does the ups and downs and tells you why it is for What Culture Wrestling. It is our good friend Simon Miller. Follow him on Twitter at Simon Miller 316. Simon, it is good to have you.
Thank you, man. It's always good to be back, and it has been a while since we last chatted, and so much has changed since we did last chat. Who the hell knows where we're going to be in a year, right? Absolutely crazy.
I get yes, absolutely. You're right. It has changed. Everything has changed. I think you and I have talked since the pandemic started, but it has been a while. Since then, everything, starting to, you see little creeps coming through and everything. So I think it's, hopefully we're getting towards the end of it. We'll see what happens. I wanted to get your thoughts. First of all, yesterday, Jim Crockett Jr. passing away. How big of an influence did he have on wrestling in the United Kingdom? Because I know that's when I first started wrestling. I'm a little bit older than you. When I first started wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions was what drew me into wrestling. Watching the NWA back then in the mid '80s with Tully and Nature Boy Buddy Landell and number one Paul Jones and all those guys. Talk for a second about how that influenced wrestling and wrestling fans in the UK.
It definitely influenced like wrestling, even if it wasn't sort of directly involved. Sort of like the big stuff that we had over here was sort of Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks and World of Sport. There wasn't a direct correlation there, but they took everything from America and it had the British spin, but you still had the over the topness and the entrances, which obviously was hugely influenced. But this is the crazy thing, like the massive wrestling territory system. If you're a wrestling fan like I am, you almost found out about Jim Crockett after the fact. You get into WWE because that's what was accessible over here. Then you find out about WCW, and it's then when you kind of want to get some history because you're like, wait a minute, there's this strange sort of divergence in the force, and that's when you learn about how sort of major Jim Crockett was. And I did a tweet earlier because I always think it's respectful if you have a social media feed that's predominantly about wrestling, you should note when huge historical figures pass away. Like I say, I think it would be disrespectful. And I was like, what do I even write? So I just said, if you don't know who he is, you don't have to. I get it. It all depends on your fandom. And I just said the short version is crazy important to pro wrestling. Like, it's you could say he was the last bastion before we did get into not the Monday Night Wars. That came a little bit later, but in terms of having WWF and WCW, it was Crockett holding on before he sold. And, some of the stories you get, like my favorite story about them flying the jet everywhere. And then the accountant saying, look, the jet cost $30,000. And on the house show last night, we didn't make $30,000. I just think it's the most bad because it didn't work out so well, but it's a wonderful wrestling story. So yeah, I thought it was really, really, it's one of those ones that passes away and you take a moment, you think, man, where does the time go? Right. It's absolutely terrifying.
Well, yeah. And you mentioned the historical perspective, talking about, for instance, the Jets and such, Jim Crockett, he wanted to make sure you bought into whether it was the Horseman or Ric Flair. And so he spent ungodly amounts of money to make sure you did that, to have it, where you had the Jets, you had the limos, you had, Flair showing up in a fur coat and then Dusty showing up the next week in that same fur coat. It's, as you said, it's a bastion of it's a point of wrestling that is kind of fading now that we are in 2021. You talk about the territories. I always laugh that in Texas we had 5 different territories in Texas between the Funks, Von Erichs, Joe Blanchard, Sam Mushnick, and then the Guerreros in El Paso. And I know at one time the Von Erichs, they were World Class was part of the NWA. So it was neat to see, say, Ric Flair show up on World Championship Wrestling on TBS, and then the next week, there he is in the Sportatorium in Dallas. So not to mention he's the one that brought Starcade. Dusty created it. He's the one that put it on and
Yeah.
carried it through. And I was thinking about it last night, especially on AEW Dynamite, when you saw Tully Blanchard returning to the ring at 67 years old, which I've met Tully a number of times and talked to him. He lives in San Antonio, and of course, family's from there, which is just down the road from me here in Austin. I used to joke with him about how I used to cuss his name because he was going to stab Magnum TA in the eye with that wooden chair in the I Quit match at Starcade 85.
Yeah.
And sure enough, he came out with that silver NWA United States Championship belt that he wore for so long, and then had FTR wearing those old NWA World Tag belts. And that had to be a tribute to Jim Crockett Promotions, and then having Arn at the end of the match come out, throw up the 4, showing the sign of excellence. It was beautiful. Give me your take on that. What did you think of the throwback that we saw from FTR and Tully last night on AEW?
Yeah, I really liked it, and I liked it for the sort of the poignancy that it had, given what was going on in reality. I also think it's probably going to lead to something else. This is probably an angle that AEW's had for a while. So they were like, hey, man, all our ducks are in a row. Let's do it. But I think my favorite thing about it was you had, on the left side, we had all this heavy nostalgia, and it was, so cool to see. But then the other side, you had a guy dressed up like a dinosaur. I just like, this is what I want from wrestling. Like, this is proper old meets new. We got Jungle Boy, we got Marco Stunt, who for some reason is why people still get on his back, I don't know. I feel like he's proven his worth, and that, again, in the crazy world of wrestling, if you have a USP, even if it is that you're quite short, you should use it, which he has done. And that was my favorite thing about it. It was a bit like the NWA had just come back for one night, because you did get those over the top characters back then as well. There probably was one that was a dinosaur that I can't remember, but yeah, I thought it was a fantastic match. I love the angle at the end, the returning of Sean Spears. It's not a criticism, it's more of an intrigue. And I said this on Ups and Downs. I would love to chat to someone who's only just started watching wrestling to see if they sort of gauge why this was so important. And maybe you don't have to. Maybe it's up to AEW to tell that story. But I know, given how long I've been watching wrestling, anytime you see the 4 fingers go up, you can't help but grin a little bit. I know that nostalgia sometimes is overdone in wrestling, but when it works, it works. And for me, it definitely worked.
Well, and it's such a simple gesture that has almost transcended generations. I mean, anytime I see Ric Flair, my hand automatically goes to the 4. Anytime I see Arn, same thing. It's one of those things. It meant so much, and it still means a lot. The 4. I still say to this day, the 4 Horsemen were the greatest faction ever.
Oh, I think you're right.
Better than the NWO, better than DX, better than better than Devastation Incorporated that we saw a lot in Texas. You take any faction you see today, all those factions owe the 4 Horsemen a debt of gratitude. Simple as that.
Yeah, totally agree.
Another man that wrestled in the Jim Crockett days, Sting. Now, look, I've been a Stinger going all the way back to when he was in Mid-South as one half of the Blade Runners. He's been one of my favorites. What have you thought of Sting and his return to the ring? What we have seen him do in the ring, especially last night, breaking out the Scorpion Deathlock, which he doesn't do often, but it was good to see that just as a throwback. Give me your impression of seeing Sting again, age 61, doing what he did way back in the day against Flair and the Horsemen and everybody else.
Yeah, I have been quite adamant ever since he arrived that I think it's an awesome hire for AEW. Like, again, I can only ever treat this stuff based on how I feel, right? And as soon as he came in with that entrance and that music, I was like, this is something I want. Even though we are playing on the WCW stuff strong, I don't care, man. I like WCW. I'm quite all right if you want to bring it back. So the big question I did have, of course, is how involved was he going to get? And if it was going to be a cinematic match, I was like, that's okay. Just getting to see Sting and suspending my disbelief and, allowing that to do whatever it's going to do is fine. And then he's getting power bombed. And like you say, he's doing Scorpion Deathlocks. He's doing Stinger Splashes. He's doing Death Drops. And you're like, this man is 61 years old. And I get that there's this huge, I don't even want to call it a criticism because I think that's giving it too much credence. But there's this whole, oh, he's too old. He shouldn't be doing it. Well, I think Sting should be the person that, makes that decision. And if AEW doctors have cleared him and said, hey, you're good to go, then he's good to go. And even if he does get injured, which I don't want to happen, that's wrestling. Anna Jay, who's a young up and coming wrestler. I don't know how old she is, but she can't be much older than mid-20s. She got injured. So you can't tie that into age all the time. So all I know is that I do, I'll admit that there was a few weeks there when it was just Sting comes out for promo, gets interrupted. Sting comes out for, I was like, okay, I kind of feel like we're seeing the same thing. But overall, I think the build has been tremendous. And despite having a crazy loaded card on Sunday, this could be the match. I mean, maybe the barbed wire thing because it's just so crazy. But outside of that, this could be the thing that I'm so excited to see the most. It's seeing Sting in a proper match where he's going to get involved because they've made that very clear. And him paying his face is the smartest thing he's ever done because he doesn't look 61. And not just, visually, but the way he moves. He doesn't. Okay, he's lost a step, but we're all going to lose a step. You can't fight that. So to me, he brings an aura, he brings credibility, he brings nostalgia, he brings history. And I mean, my word, if you can't learn something from Sting, what's going on? So I bet all the young guys benefit as well. So yeah, like you, man, I'll be a Stinger forever. I'm a huge fan of Sting.
And I would say last night was probably the best exhibition of his charisma. Because the little bit of interview he did with Tony Schiavone, you started to hear the old surfer Sting.
I really agree, yeah.
That fire that's in him. I mean, I was getting pumped just listening to that, and then to see him and to hit the Scorpion on none other than Ricky Starks, who we know really well here in Austin. I called a bunch of his matches here in Austin on the independent scene, and I joked with Ricky a couple weeks ago. He came back, and I joked with him. I said, "You be careful with Sting. I'm telling you now. Otherwise, you're gonna have me to deal with." And he laughed me off. It was so funny, but I said it couldn't have happened to a better guy. I love Ricky to death. Don't get me wrong. All right, so we got to go from one end of the spectrum to the other. How many Randy Ortons are you expecting to see next week on Raw?
See, this is another reason I love wrestling. What a transition we're able to make, man. Here's my thing with what they're doing. Fair play to them, right? They wanted to do some spooky hocus pocus stuff and they've stuck with it. And I'm not going to be a hypocrite because, my biggest bugbear with WWE is that they'll drop stories like nobody's business. And I hate it. It just really drives me nuts because even a rubbish storyline I'd like an ending to. How did it end? Whenever somebody asks you, how did this end? And you have to go, I don't know. That's bad. That's bad television, not just when it comes to wrestling. So I'm pleased they're doing it. But in terms of personal taste, no, this one isn't really doing it for me. And look, I like Hocus Pocus. I liked Undertaker and Kane firing lightning bolts at each other. I mean, I was so much younger then. So there may be kids loving it, but I don't know. I just don't know what I'm meant to take away from it. Like, is this an hallucination? And if so, why can I see it? Who is this person? He's kind of the bad Randy Orton, but I thought, Randy Orton was the bad Randy Orton. So utterly baffling. I mean, kind of entertaining, we get to chat about it here and laugh about it. No idea where it's going to go, though. And really quite dark. Like that demonic Pentagon stuff that Alexa Bliss sits in is far more edgy than WWE usually goes for. And I mean, I know it's sort of cheesy, but still, I bet if you showed that to the wrong person, they could be offended. I'd be like, yes, I can understand where you're coming from. So maybe there's 9 of them next week. Honestly, it was the last thing I was expecting. I mean, the goo was one thing that came out of his mouth, but yeah, multiple Randy Ortons. We're living in a strange timeline. I will tell you that.
We really are. I'm like you. It's not in my bag. I do give them credit. They are sticking with it, and okay. And I guess for the sake of absurdity, I'm mildly curious to see.
Yeah,
we get heel Randy Orton versus evil Randy Orton. I don't know, what the difference is. You mentioned the pentagram and that imagery. And look, again, here in Texas, and I grew up a heavily Christian, in a heavily Christian atmosphere. So yeah, I could see easily how that would, offend most of the people I used to that I grew up with. It's interesting that they went with that imagery. I'll give it that. So how this ends up, and I know it's going to end up with some form of the Fiend reappearing. We don't know what that is. I assume there's going to be at least a charred version of the mask. I don't know. It's just like you said, it's crazy times in wrestling. We're talking. Bobby Lashley as WWE champion. Does he hold on to the title past WrestleMania?
It's a real tough one, isn't it? It's really tough because I think we are, as in the general wrestling fan population, has forgotten. Like, we're all, actually, I personally don't say this, but I get it. The consensus is, oh, bring back the Attitude Era, bring back the Attitude Era. And then Bobby Lashley wins the title in early March, whatever it was. Seems like he's going to lose it in a month. And everyone's like, oh, we never would have done this back by the day. Man, we did this 20 years ago. In 2001. The Rock beat Kurt Angle 4 weeks before WrestleMania, and they lost it to Stone Cold Steve Austin. So I think that's where you get to the confusing is probably a bit strong, but it all depends on what the story is now. And I'm sure there were people in the very early arrival of the internet going, oh, I can't believe they're doing this. Damn you, Stone Cold. But it is all about the execution. And just because of the way I watch wrestling, which I will admit to a certain extent is not the way you should watch wrestling, I want Bobby Lashley to have a long reign because I've enjoyed Bobby Lashley, right? I enjoyed it when he first came on the scene and he was pushed earlier than he probably should have been because Vince was like, well, look at that guy. Obviously, ironically, coincidentally thought it was amazing when him and MVP were doing their thing in TNA. Makes sense why they've done that again now. And he's finally won the big one. So you don't want to drop that if there's no point. But at the same time, if you come up with this awesome comeback story for Drew McIntyre and I get to April the 10th or 11th and I'm like, well, that's what I want to see, then that's what we should do. And hopefully we keep Bobby Lashley in the title picture. Like, there's no reason why he can't win it again. And his first reign is somewhat of a transitional champion. So I think I'm just going to enjoy it for what it was. Like, it was the right thing to do. I kind of felt like the way they booked it took away from the impact a little bit. Because even I was like, well, I could beat Miz at this stage. Like, it's such a, I get that's what you're meant to think, but maybe it would have been a bit cooler if we had done it. But more importantly, I like Bobby Lashley as WWE champion. And again, it ties into that WWE has remembered that they can do long-term storytelling. I don't think this was the plan when we turned Bobby Lashley into a killer, but at least it paid off, right? And of course he'd be the champion because no one can beat Bobby Lashley. So I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's probably something that Raw needed. And look, I'm going to say best or worst case scenario, Drew winning it again in front of a bunch of fans at WrestleMania. I think if there's any dude on the roster that deserves that after having win his first championship in front of nobody, you can give Drew McIntyre his due.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think Drew McIntyre is a fantastic individual, as is Bobby Lashley. So I would be good with either one of them. Let me ask you this. The way they have brought Bobby Lashley on and eventually gave him the title, does it feel similar to what they did with Kofi Kingston?
It does a little bit. Because it doesn't really feel like it. It felt like it was a happenstance as opposed to this is the plan. And I love Kofi Kingston as champion, but I think we can all agree the reign was from no fault of his own. It's a bit Rey Mysterio. It's the way I'll describe it. It's like he's kind of the guy, but he's not really the guy, and then he just loses, to Brock Lesnar in 7 seconds or whatever it was. And I do think we've kind of stumbled into that again. But I mean, WWE stumbles into a lot of stuff these days. These things just kind of happen. Like, the only real, in terms of the championship sort of plot that we had was Drew McIntyre, right? Which started at the Royal Rumble last year, but it was like, okay, Brock's going to chuck everybody out, and then Drew's going to throw out Brock. And of course, originally the plan was that Drew wasn't going to win. And then somebody went, oh no, if Drew wins, that'll be even better. So it all came together. I think just by the nature of Vince McMahon, Bobby Lashley will be treated better at the end because he's big. If you're a big guy in WWE, you'll be protected. But I am intrigued to see what to see what we do. But yeah, it does have that Rey Mysterio syndrome where it's a bit like, okay, you're our champion, or even CM Punk, or or Daniel Bryan when he was the world heavyweight champion. We're going to put you on top, but your match is going to be semi-main event. It's like, it never makes any sense. But hey, man, that's wrestling for you.
That is wrestling. Speaking of semi-main event, main event, SmackDown, and It always cracks me up watching you on Ups and Downs talk about Roman Reigns. I think it's just it makes me smile. Does it feel like and maybe it's just me, but does it feel like they seem to be in a pattern, kind of a repetitive pattern with Roman, and he'll build up a feud and then it's Jay beating him up, or it just feels, it's felt the last couple of months like it's been a little repetitive. Maybe it's just me. Do you get that sense, or help me understand if I'm wrong?
No, I think no. There's definitely something to that, and I don't think you could argue that. There's definitely something to it. It's almost like Roman Reigns has cemented his position as the top of the card, and nobody can touch him. I think the reason I get a kick out of it is, based on what you said, is the characterization stuff. It kind of makes sense that it would be that way. It's almost like he's got too much power, he's untouchable, whichever word that we want to use. But I think it's kind of shown itself that way a little bit, because now we've got this fast lane shown in the way. It doesn't really seem like WWE knows how to get through that in order to get to Roman versus Edge at WrestleMania. Like, at one moment it was going to be a tag match at Fastlane, then it was going to be a one-on-one match, and now I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. So I think that definitely ties into your point. I think the real trick is going to be, what do we do post WrestleMania? Like, Reigns wins and beats Edge. Great story, by the way. There's nothing wrong with the tragic ending when told properly. Again, then you do need to start changing it up, right? We can't just, you have to add something in there or take something away. But if Edge wins, then what happens to Roman Reigns? Because you're going to have to see some kind of vulnerability or, some kind of transparency. So I think they can probably run it until then. But when we hit reset and we start the season again, as they sometimes say, you're going to have to come up with something a little bit different. And it all depends whether he's the champion or not. And I don't know where that goes. That's the interesting thing to me, actually, on both shows. I was convinced that Drew would win at Mania, then we do the big Sheamus feud. But now that kind of seemed pointless because we did it on Raw. And when I think about a Roman Reigns post WrestleMania, I don't know who. I mean, maybe Cesaro. If Cesaro beats Seth Rollins, you could do that. But they don't have too many challenges lined up. So it's going to be interesting watch. But I certainly do take your point. I think I get such a kick out of crazy Roman Reigns that maybe I give it a little bit of a pass. But yes, I think we're on the cusp. Yeah,
I think that's what saves it, is watching you the day after with the fleet. So before I let you go, Simon, and I so appreciate this time.
Anytime.
We can get your thoughts on New Japan. They're gonna merge the two titles. We're gonna have the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship. Does this seem like, and we know New Japan's under new management, new chairman, and everything. That's why we're seeing some of the moves they're making. They've sent Finjuice to Impact, sent Kenta to AEW. Does it feel like there is this undercurrent of New Japan Pro Wrestling becoming a little more Americanized?
That's a really good way to put it. And I think probably intentional, right? Because they've got that deal on Roku or whatever the service is.
Yes.
And there's still rumors that they have another American TV deal in the works. So maybe that's their plan. Maybe they think we need to alter what we do just slightly to try and appeal. Because that's always been their goal, right? Is to have an awesome audience in the East, which of course they do. And then try and build our audience in the West. And it's never really happened. Like, we've had a few amazing shows. Like, I was at the one they did with Ring of Honor at Madison Square Garden over WrestleMania weekend. That really was tremendous. So that really was, I felt like you were part of something.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, the pandemic has come and kind of stolen away a lot of the momentum they had. But yeah, I thought it was kind of strange, the merging of the titles. But I'm not against it because they have other titles that they can push. And so many, the big criticism I saw some people saying was like, oh, but now they got rid of the lineage of the old IWGP title. I'm like, well, only because they said they did. We all know. We're not going to forget all the people that have held it before. It's like when people go, oh, if the Undertaker wrestles again, he's ruined his legacy. It's like, well, no, just ignore this bit and just remember the bit that you like. It's not going to go anywhere. So I'm intrigued. I think when the borders are open again, I mean, obviously, we're going to get just an influx of New Japan talent coming over here and AEW going over there. And if they are making waves to try and have a more, we'll go with Americanized product, for lack of a better term, it may work as long as they keep what makes them New Japan too. Like, you don't want to, that's why they have the popularity that they do, because they do offer a completely different brand of pro wrestling. a lot of people dropping on their heads. That's
Yeah.
what they have. So maybe it's a good idea that they've done this. I mean, it's something that I would like WWE to do. I'd love it if they merged the WWE and Universal Championships, because I think it would make it feel a bit more special. So, as long as they sort of take the never open title and the other ones that they've got the US title and still make them feel important, I don't think one less belt is going to be a massive problem.
It did start. It was a little bit, and again, reckon back to the Crockett era. It felt a little like the NWA back then, because they had all these secondary titles: the national title, the U.S. title. You had the American title that was defended at World Class, and then you had the multiple tag team titles, and had of course the territory titles like the Florida and Mid Atlantic. So I'm okay with maybe pulling back on one of them, merging them, and like you said, and I think that it will. I think it will. Hopefully, it will lead to some good stuff. And like you said, I want them to stay as New Japan as possible. I don't want to see, a WWEization or whatever. Like you said,
that would just it would just you'll annoy your core fan base, and then that's always the end, as we've seen with other promotions.
Absolutely. He is Simon Miller. Catch him upping and downing everything in world and telling you why it is on What Culture Wrestling. Go to whatculture.com/WWE. Follow him on Twitter at Simon Miller 316. Catch all the videos on What Culture's YouTube channel. Simon, it's so good to see you and talk to you. I will make you this promise. So hopefully we are getting towards the end of the pandemic, and that it is over by the time WrestleMania comes to the great state of Texas next year in Arlington. I'm putting the invite now. I will personally take you and the What Culture crew out for proper Texas dinner.
Man, honestly, especially given recent times, sounds awesome. And I can guarantee you that hopefully by then the world will be open, and me and the gang will 100% be there, and we will take you up on that offer. You're a very good man.